Family doesn't forget you, they just remember your wallet. The text arrived as I was pulling on my law school graduation gown. Can you help me pay the bills? No congratulations, no pride, just proof of what I existed for. I stood alone in a borrowed bathroom, the mirror still fogged from someone else's shower. The apartment belonged to a classmate who had offered her place when she heard I needed somewhere to get ready. She didn't ask why I wasn't at home with my family. She just handed me a key and said she'd meet me at the ceremony. My mother was in Paris with my brother Lucas, the same brother who had shrugged last month and asked, "What's so special about a graduation anyway?" They hadn't forgotten my graduation. They remembered my bank account. I didn't reply. I blocked the number. That was the day I stopped funding their silence and quietly began taking my power back. The gown felt heavier than it should have. Not because of the fabric, but because of what it represented. Years of debt spreadsheets, night classes after full shifts, weekends buried in case law while everyone else posted brunch photos. I had started law school at 28, 4 years older than most of my classmates, because I'd spent my 20s working jobs that paid well enough to cover my parents' shortfalls. By the time I enrolled, I had savings most people my age didn't have, and a bone-deep exhaustion most people my age couldn't understand. This wasn't a celebration. It was a finish line I'd crawled across alone. My name is Sophia Whitmore. I was 32 years old that morning, and this wasn't a dream come true. It was survival with a diploma attached. I'd been the responsible one for as long as I could remember, the one who learned early that asking for help came with strings. That gratitude was expected in advance, that being good meant being quiet. When money was tight, I found extra shifts. When my parents needed help, I rearranged my life. When Lucas needed a little boost, I covered it. None of it was dramatic. It was routine. That's how you don't notice the cost until you stop paying. I thought about my brother as I adjusted my cap in the mirror. Lucas was 2 years younger than me, but had always been treated like the elder, the one whose needs came first, whose feelings required management, whose potential was always just about to bloom. He'd started 3 different business ventures in the past decade, each one funded partially by loans he never repaid, and partially by money I sent home without being asked. Our parents called him entrepreneurial. They called me reliable. The difference in those words contained everything. I checked my phone again, half expecting a delayed, "We're so proud of you." Nothing. No missed calls, no group chat buzzing with plans. The silence wasn't new, but today it was louder. I told myself not to spiral. People get busy. Flights get delayed, time zones blur. I had told them the date months ago, sent reminders, and shared the program link. They'd responded with thumbs-up emojis and vague enthusiasm. I'd translated that into hope, because that's what I'd always done, filled the gaps myself. Then I opened social media. There it was, a bright, effortless photo from my mother tagged by Lucas, a cafe table somewhere far away, croissants arranged artfully beside 2 cups of coffee, captions, in all caps about being in love with this city. Paris. Again. The city wasn't the point. The choice was. The timing was. The fact that it never occurred to them to hesitate. I scrolled through the comments. Friends of my mother leaving heart emojis. Someone asking how long they'd be staying. Lucas responded that they might extend the trip if the weather held. My graduation was happening in 6 hours, and they were discussing whether to stay longer. I remembered Lucas's laugh the last time I'd mentioned graduation. We'd been on a family video call, rare enough that I'd noted it on my calendar, and I'd mentioned the ceremony date. My mother had nodded absently, already looking at something off screen. My father had said, "That's nice, sweetheart." And Lucas had laughed that casual, dismissive sound he made when something didn't register as important to him, and said, "What's so special about a graduation anyway? You walk across a stage and get a piece of paper." It hadn't sounded cruel at the time, just dismissive, like the weather, like something that didn't require him to adjust his plans. Standing there, gown half-zipped, I realized this wasn't an accident. It was a decision. The text sat on my screen like an invoice. No greeting, no acknowledgement of the day, just a need delivered with the confidence of habit. They hadn't asked if I was nervous. They hadn't asked where I was sitting or whether I'd found parking or if I wanted company. They asked for money. I thought about all the times I'd answered without thinking, the reflex to smooth things over to be useful to keep the peace. I thought about how often my silence had been mistaken for agreement, how many conversations I'd financed simply by staying quiet. I imagined typing a response, something polite, something explanatory, something that would keep the story tidy for them. I imagined the relief that would follow the familiar easing of tension when I did what was expected. I imagined the weight settling back onto my shoulders heavier each time until one day I wouldn't be able to stand up straight at all. Then I set the phone down. I zipped the gown. I straightened the collar. I looked at myself in the mirror, really looked, and saw someone who had spent a decade being convenient, being available, being the person who made everyone else's problems disappear. I took one long breath and did something that felt both terrifying and small. I didn't reply. I blocked the number. The relief didn't come right away. What came was a strange clarity, sharp and almost physical, a recognition that this moment, this quiet, unshared milestone, wasn't going to be honored unless I honored it myself, that I could either keep translating neglect into understanding or I could stop participating. I walked out into the hallway, the sound of other graduates' voices drifting through the air, laughter, families, cameras clicking. I saw a father adjusting his daughter's tassel, his eyes wet with pride. I saw a mother smoothing invisible wrinkles from her son's gown, talking too fast the way people do when they're trying not to cry. I felt out of place and for the first time unanchored. But underneath that was something steadier than pride. Resolve. This wasn't about punishing anyone. It wasn't about making a scene. It was about noticing the pattern and refusing to call it love anymore. It was about choosing not to explain myself into exhaustion. As I joined the line of graduates filing toward the auditorium, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. I didn't look at it. I knew the silence wouldn't last. I knew they'd notice. I knew there would be calls from different numbers, messages framed as concern pressure disguised as reason. I didn't know how far they'd go or what names they'd use for me when I didn't bend. But I knew one thing with a certainty I'd never felt before. That silence was about to cost them far more than money. The first call came less than 5 minutes after I blocked my mom's number. I didn't hear it ring. I saw it light up my screen while I was standing in line with the other graduates, my phone buzzing insistently in my hand. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again and again. Then my phone vibrated with a message from an app I barely used anymore, one my mother had insisted we all download years ago for family communication, but which had mostly served as a platform for her to share articles about Lucas's various ventures. "Are you okay? Why aren't you answering?" Not congratulations, not "we're proud of you," just confusion that I wasn't available on demand. I stepped out of line and moved toward the edge of the hallway, away from the noise of excited families and nervous graduates. A woman nearby was pinning a corsage onto her daughter's gown, while her husband filmed the whole thing on his phone. The daughter was rolling her eyes, but smiling. I looked away. My phone kept lighting up the vibration, now constant, impatient. They weren't panicking because they couldn't reach me. They were panicking because the routine had broken, because silence wasn't part of the agreement they thought we had. Another message came through, this time from my mother's email. "Don't make this a thing, Sophia. We'll celebrate later." Later. As if pride could be postponed, as if showing up was optional, as if my graduation were a dentist appointment we could reschedule without consequence. I stared at that word later and felt the familiar machinery of justification trying to start up in my mind. Maybe they really did have to be in Paris. Maybe something came up. Maybe I was being too sensitive. The machinery had run smoothly for 32 years. It knew exactly how to process disappointment into understanding, how to convert hurt into patience, how to transform neglect into nothing to see here. But today, the machinery stuttered. Today, it couldn't quite catch. Then my dad chimed in, "You know how your brother needs this trip? It's just a ceremony." Just a ceremony. The words landed heavier than anything else that morning. Years of work reduced to a formality, a line item. Some polite people attend if they don't have better plans. I thought about what "your brother needs this trip" actually meant. Lucas had been talking for months about networking opportunities in Paris, about investors he was planning to meet, about how this could be the trip that finally launched his consulting business into the stratosphere. My parents had been funding this dream since before I started law school. I had been funding it too, though I'd stopped keeping track of the exact amounts years ago, because the numbers made me feel something I didn't want to name. I stared at the screen and felt something click into place. Not anger. Recognition. They weren't minimizing my graduation because they didn't understand it. They were minimizing it because it inconvenienced them. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Lucas. My brother never sounded rushed, even over text. His messages were always calm, reasonable, carefully worded, like he was stepping into a situation he believed he could manage. He'd learned early that composure was a kind of currency, that staying calm while others got upset positioned you as the reasonable one, the one others should listen to. "Mom's really stressed," he wrote. "You know she counts on you." There it was, the sentence that explained everything. I wasn't their daughter in moments like this. I was their buffer, their solution, the person who absorbed stress so they didn't have to adjust their lives. Lucas didn't apologize. He didn't ask where I was or how I felt. He didn't mention that I was about to receive a law degree after 4 years of balancing work and school while sending money home every month. He framed himself as the mediator, the one stepping in to smooth things over, as if the conflict were between me and circumstance instead of me and a pattern he benefited from. I didn't answer him either. I walked into the auditorium and found my seat, my phone face down in my lap. Around me, families leaned in close, whispering, pointing, taking photos. I watched a woman a few rows ahead hug her daughter, adjusting her cap with trembling hands. The mother was crying already before the ceremony had even begun. I felt a flicker of something sharp and familiar, then let it pass. My phone buzzed again. "You're really doing this today," my mom wrote. "After everything we did for you." That was the first time the tone shifted. Not concerned, not confusion, judgment. Graduation day apparently was an appropriate time to put me on trial. I thought back not in long, winding flashbacks, but in sharp, specific moments. The times I'd sent money without being asked because I knew it was expected. The birthday when I'd turned 25 and sent home half my bonus check because Lucas's first business had just failed and everyone was worried. The Christmas I'd worked through because flights home were expensive and the money was needed elsewhere. The times I'd stayed quiet, when something felt unfair, because speaking up would cause stress. The way peace always followed my compliance and tension followed my boundaries. The pattern wasn't complicated. When I paid, things were calm. When I stayed silent, I was mature. When I hesitated, I was emotional. They weren't asking because they needed help. They were asking because I always said yes. The ceremony began. Names were called. Applause rose and fell like waves. I watched my classmates walk across the stage one by one, watched their families stand and cheer and snap photos. Some people had brought signs, some had brought flowers. One family had spelled out their graduate's name in individual letters, each person holding one, coordinating their rise from their seats like a choreographed celebration. I stood when it was my turn, walked across the stage, and accepted the folder with my name on it. I smiled for the camera out of reflex, not joy. The dean shook my hand and said, "Congratulations," and for a moment I let myself feel the weight of what I'd accomplished. 4 years, working full-time, studying every night, and I'd finished in the top 15% of my class. Then I sat back down, and my phone buzzed again. "Lucas, can you just call her? She's really upset." There was no acknowledgement of what I'd just done. No recognition that I'd crossed a finish line that mattered. No, "Hey, congratulations, we'll celebrate when we get back." The only thing that mattered was restoring the balance they were used to. I didn't call. Instead, I did something I'd never done before. I opened my banking app. My hands were steady as I scrolled through the familiar list of transfers and recurring payments. The numbers didn't shock me anymore. I'd seen them too many times. Rent assistance here, $400 monthly auto-transferred every first of the month. A utility bill there, $150, because my parents' house had expensive heating. And someone had to help. A temporary loan that had become permanent without discussion, $200 monthly, initiated 3 years ago when Lucas needed startup capital, and everyone agreed I could help out for a few months. The total when I added it up was $750 every month, $9,000 a year, more than my student loan payments, more than my own rent when I'd been living in a studio apartment during my first year of law school. I turned off the auto transfer. I removed access to the secondary account, the one I'd set up years ago, so my mother could just grab what she needed during emergencies, which had somehow become a regular withdrawal point. I canceled one recurring payment that had been labeled "just until things settle," a phrase that apparently meant forever. I didn't announce it. I didn't warn anyone. I didn't explain. I closed the app and locked my phone. The ceremony ended. People stood hugged and cried. I slipped out quietly and walked toward the parking lot, the late afternoon sun warm on my face. The sky was clear and blue, the kind of perfect spring day that felt like a gift. My phone stayed silent for almost 10 minutes. Then it exploded. Missed calls, voicemails, messages stacked on top of each other, the tone shifting with each one. "Did you change something? Call me now." "This isn't funny." Lucas's messages lost their calm. "What did you do? We can't access the account." My mother's words sharpened. "This is not okay, Sophia. You can't just disappear like this." Disappear. As if I hadn't been present for years. As if my availability had been mistaken for visibility. I didn't respond. I sat in my car and watched families load folding chairs into trunks, watched balloons bob in the breeze, watched life move forward without waiting for my explanation. The messages kept coming faster now. The calm veneer was gone. The irritation had turned into something closer to fear. They weren't used to this version of me. The one who didn't explain herself into exhaustion. The one who made changes without asking permission. As I pulled out of the parking lot, my phone buzzed again. I didn't look at it. They thought I was being emotional. They thought this was about a ceremony. They hadn't realized I'd already stopped playing my old role. Silence lasted longer than I expected, but not in the way I hoped. I thought if I stopped answering, stopped reacting, the noise would die down on its own, that people would eventually get bored and move on. But instead, silence became an open space other people rushed to fill. The first message didn't come from my parents or from Lucas. It came from someone else entirely, a cousin I spoke to maybe twice a year at holiday gatherings where we exchanged pleasantries about weather and work. She wasn't angry or accusatory. She sounded almost gentle. "Hey, I heard things are kind of tense at home. Are you okay?" I stared at the words longer than I should have. There was something unsettling about how calmly they landed, how easily they assumed a truth I hadn't spoken. How did she know there was tension? Who had told her? And more importantly, what version of the story had she heard? More messages followed over the next day. Different names, different numbers, all variations of the same theme. "Your mom's been really upset. I heard you and your family aren't talking. I hope everything works out." Not one mentioned my graduation. Not one referenced Paris. Not one asked about the text requesting money. Those details had already been removed from circulation, edited out like irrelevant footnotes. What remained was a clean, portable version of events where tension existed without cause and hurt existed without context. Somehow I was standing at the center of it. I realized slowly, with a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with panic, that my family hadn't waited to hear what I had to say. They'd gone ahead and told their version first, a version that didn't need explanation because it fit neatly into something people already understood: the familiar story of a daughter who changed, who became distant, who let success go to her head. The messages blurred together, the same phrases repeated in slightly different voices. "We're worried about you." "This isn't like you. Your mom just wants to make things right." That's when it clicked that this wasn't a coincidence. It was coordination, the quiet efficiency of a narrative designed to travel well. In their telling, I wasn't overwhelmed or hurt. I was cold. I wasn't setting boundaries. I was different after law school. That phrase showed up more than once, like a diagnosis passed between people who hadn't examined the patient. Someone told me my dad said I thought I was better than everyone now, that I'd let my degree change me. Someone else said my mom didn't recognize me anymore, that I wasn't the same girl she raised. My graduation, the event they couldn't be bothered to attend, had somehow been transformed into evidence. Not of effort or resilience, but of ego. It struck me then that my achievement had never been neutral to them. It had always been a liability, a reminder that I was capable of stepping outside the role they'd assigned me. As long as I was the reliable one, the one who helped the one who showed up my education was tolerable. But the moment I used that education to question the arrangement, the moment it gave me the confidence to say no, it became a threat. Lucas, of course, was protected in every version of the story, described as stressed, overwhelmed, under pressure, someone who hadn't meant anything by the timing of the trip, as if Paris had happened to him instead of being a choice he made, as if the trip were weather something that occurred rather than something decided. The trip itself was reduced to bad luck, an unfortunate coincidence, while my graduation was described as flexible, something that could be celebrated any time. The story was crafted carefully, so no one had to apologize or take responsibility. Except me. I understood then that this wasn't about misunderstanding or hurt feelings, it was about control, about maintaining a system where my availability was assumed and my absence needed to be explained away before it inspired questions. They didn't need me to speak. They needed everyone else to believe them first, to accept a version of me that justified their behavior without requiring change. My silence wasn't something they were reacting to anymore. It was something they were actively replacing, rewriting, with enough confidence that it became truth by repetition. I felt the pull to correct it, to set the record straight, to send one long message that laid everything out in order. I even started drafting it once late at night, cataloging dates and amounts and messages, building a case as if I were preparing for trial. But I recognized the trap for what it was. Any defense I offered would be folded into their narrative as proof of my emotional instability, my sensitivity, my inability to let things go. "See how she keeps bringing up money," they'd say. "See how she can't move on." I wasn't willing to argue inside a frame designed to keep me on trial, so I didn't post anything. I didn't send explanations or receipts. When someone reached out directly, I answered simply, calmly, without urgency or defensiveness. "Thanks for checking in. I'm doing fine." I refused to perform the role they expected, neither the grateful daughter returning to the fold, nor the angry villain confirming their story. Without my reactions, their narrative lost momentum. There were no angry texts to forward, no dramatic replies to quote, no evidence of the villain they'd described. People didn't turn against my family so much as they stopped leaning in, stopped asking follow-up questions, stopped carrying the story forward with the same enthusiasm. The narrative didn't collapse, it just developed cracks, moments where it didn't quite add up. That was enough to slow it down. In the quiet that followed, I understood the danger more clearly than before. My silence wasn't bringing me back into line. It was costing them control. And when people lose control, they don't just keep talking, they escalate. The shift was subtle at first, almost polite. The kind of quiet that pretends to be respectful until you listen closely and realize it's just a pause taken to reload. After the stories about me stopped traveling so easily, after the messages from third parties thinned out, and the questions lost their urgency, my family went silent in a way that felt deliberate rather than defeated. A week passed with no contact, then two. I knew better than to mistake that stillness for acceptance. It carried the same weight as a door being locked from the other side. The next contact didn't come wrapped in concern or confusion. It arrived with instructions. The language gave it away immediately, sentences that began with what I needed to do, what had gone far enough, what was embarrassing them now that people were starting to ask fewer questions. "It's time to put this behind us," my mother wrote. "Call me tonight. We need to discuss how to move forward." They didn't ask how I was or whether I wanted to talk. They told me it was time, that this had gone on long enough, that I was being unreasonable. The words landed with a familiarity that made my shoulders tighten before my mind caught up. I recognized the tone as the one they used when they believed compliance was inevitable, when my resistance was just a temporary inconvenience to be managed rather than a position to be respected. When the calls came from numbers I didn't recognize, when the voicemails stacked up without pauses between them, I understood that the soft approaches had failed and the next phase had begun. The one where they stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding and started treating it like a problem to be corrected. I answered one call, just one. Not because I wanted to explain myself, but because I wanted to hear how they were framing it now. My father's voice came through calm and measured the way he spoke when he believed he was being reasonable. He had always been the one they sent in when things got serious, the voice of authority that expected to be obeyed simply because it was speaking. He told me this had gotten out of hand. Those people were talking, that I was embarrassing the family. "Your mother hasn't slept properly in weeks," he said. "Is that what you want?" When he said, "Your mother raised you better than this," it wasn't an insult so much as a verdict, a declaration that I had failed to live up to an unspoken contract. He didn't ask what had happened. He told me what it meant, that my refusal to engage was abandonment, that my boundaries were punishment, that my graduation had gone to my head. In that reframing, my achievement became the motive for my supposed cruelty, as if education itself had corrupted me, as if knowing my worth was the same as thinking I was better than everyone else. My mother followed with messages that leaned hard on obligation without ever naming it directly. Reminders of sacrifices made, of years spent supporting me, of everything they had done that now required repayment. "I gave up opportunities for you," she wrote. "I stayed home when I could have had a career, and this is the thanks I get." Every sentence ended where it always did, with the assumption that I would eventually step back into place, because that's what I had always done before. The messages weren't really arguments. They were statements of faith in a version of me that no longer existed. Lucas reappeared too, not as the reasonable intermediary this time, but as a shield, insisting Mom couldn't handle the stress, that I was stronger than this, that I should be the bigger person. "You know how she gets," he wrote. "You've always been the one who could handle things. Why are you making this harder than it needs to be?" The implication was clear. My capacity to endure was being used as justification for why I should keep enduring. My strength wasn't a quality to be admired. It was a resource to be extracted. What struck me most wasn't the anger, though there was plenty of it beneath the surface, but the confidence. The certainty that they still had the authority to define what was happening and what it meant, as if my silence hadn't already disrupted the story they were telling. They spoke as though the problem wasn't my absence, but my refusal to return. I realized then that nothing about them had changed except the tactics. The core assumption remained intact, that my role was to smooth things over, to absorb discomfort, to keep the family functioning by making myself smaller. When I didn't respond to the commands disguised as concern, the language sharpened further, accusations replacing explanations. Words like selfish and ungrateful appear where empathy was supposed to be. For the first time, there was no attempt to maintain the image of a reasonable family misunderstanding, just raw frustration that the usual levers weren't working. I noticed something else too, something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. How quickly the mask slipped when their authority was questioned. How easily kindness gave way to contempt when compliance wasn't immediate. It became impossible to unsee the pattern, the way control had always been dressed up as care until it was challenged. I sent one message then, a single line without explanation or apology. "I'm not discussing money. This conversation is over." The response was immediate and explosive, as if naming the boundary out loud had stripped them of any remaining pretense. The messages came faster, angrier, less concerned with appearances. I could almost feel the panic behind them, the realization that the old methods weren't just ineffective, but irrelevant now that I'd stopped engaging on their terms. Somewhere in the flood of words, it became clear that they weren't trying to understand me or repair anything. They were trying to restore a system that had worked for them. The urgency wasn't about reconciliation. It was about access, about regaining the ability to pull me back whenever they needed stability or resources. I didn't argue. I didn't clarify. I didn't soften my language to make it easier for them to accept. Because I understood at last that explaining myself would only reopen the door I had just closed. And the cost of keeping it shut was far less than the cost of stepping through it again. As the anger burned itself out and gave way to something colder, I sensed the shift toward action. The point where words would no longer suffice, and they would look for other ways to reassert control. They hadn't changed. They had simply escalated. And if I didn't give them what they wanted, I knew they would try to take something instead. The first sign came the morning after I sent that final line. My phone lit up, not with a message from my family, but with an automated alert from my bank, the kind of notification I usually skimmed without thinking. Except this time the wording made my stomach drop. It referenced a change I hadn't made, an action I hadn't authorized. I was still in bed, not quite awake when I saw it. For a moment I thought I must have misread. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. Account alert authorized user access modified. As I opened the app with a tightening chest, I felt the moment tilt from emotional warfare into something colder and far more dangerous. It wasn't a misunderstanding or a glitch. It was a real transaction, a shift in access, a quiet adjustment made somewhere behind the scenes. Someone else had acted on my accounts as if they had every right to do so. I sat there longer than I meant to. Not frozen exactly, but recalibrating. A part of me had truly believed that once I stated my boundary, they would retreat, that even they would recognize a line when it was drawn in ink instead of implication, that there were some things the family simply didn't do to each other. Realizing how wrong I was felt less like heartbreak and more like a cold slap. Digging deeper revealed what I had forgotten or perhaps never fully acknowledged. Years ago, during a different phase of my life, when trust still felt safe and convenience masqueraded as closeness, I had granted limited access. It had been my mother's idea. Just in case of emergencies, she'd said. What if something happened to you? What if we needed to help with bills while you were in school? It had seemed reasonable at the time. It seemed like what families did. I had set things up to make it easier, to help in emergencies, to smooth over moments when money had been tight and I had stepped in without hesitation. Those permissions had lingered quietly in the background like keys to a house I'd forgotten I'd handed out. Until now. The boundary I had drawn with words had been met with a boundary they erased with action. The realization that they felt entitled to do so settled heavily in my chest. It meant they didn't see my finances as mine at all, only as a shared resource I happened to manage. My money wasn't mine. It was theirs, temporarily held in my account until they needed it. My mother called shortly after. Her tone was brisk and strangely relieved, as if she were updating me on a chore she'd already finished. I just wanted to let you know we took care of the bills, she said. You hadn't been responding, so we figured you were busy. It's handled. You don't need to worry. When I asked what exactly she meant, there was no apology in her voice, no pause to consider whether she'd overstepped, just the casual certainty of someone who believed they were operating well within their rights. The money was just sitting there, she said. And you know we needed it. You weren't using it. She said I didn't need the money right now anyway. That sentence landed with a particular cruelty because it reframed my hard-earned stability as justification for taking control. My success twisted into proof that I could absorb the loss without complaint. The savings I'd built through years of discipline and sacrifice weren't an accomplishment to be respected. They were evidence that I had too much that I could spare some, that my comfort was less important than their need. When Lucas texted, it was with the same dismissive confidence. He told me I was overreacting, that it was temporary, that I was making a big deal out of something small. It's not like we stole from you, he wrote. It's family money. You act like we're criminals. In those few words, the entire structure revealed itself, the way my money had become communal in their minds, the way my consent had been downgraded to a courtesy rather than a requirement. There was a moment then, brief but absolute, when the last trace of doubt fell away. I stopped wondering if this was stress or poor communication or an unfortunate series of misunderstandings. No one accidentally does something like this. You don't cross a line you don't believe exists. They hadn't stumbled into this violation. They had stepped over it deliberately confident I would either forgive them or be forced to accept it. That confidence was the most damning part of all. I didn't argue with them or demand explanations. I didn't raise my voice or threaten consequences. Something in me had gone very still, the way it does when panic gives way to focus. Instead of reacting, I started making calls, quiet ones, methodical ones, to the bank, to a financial advisor I trusted, to people whose job it was to understand systems and shut doors properly. I spent the next several hours on hold explaining my situation to representatives, verifying my identity, signing documents, and answering security questions. It was tedious and exhausting, but it was also clarifying. Each form I filled out, each password I changed, each authorized user I removed, it felt like reclaiming territory I hadn't known I'd surrendered. I revoked access piece by piece, reset credentials, separated accounts, built walls where there had once been open hallways. I did it without informing my family, not out of spite, but out of necessity, because announcing it would only invite interference. I was done negotiating my right to autonomy. The process took hours. By the time it was finished, my hands were steady in a way they hadn't been all morning, the kind of steadiness that comes from reclaiming ground you didn't realize had been occupied. The fallout was immediate and unmistakable. My phone erupted with messages that shifted rapidly from anger to confusion to outright fear, questions piling on top of one another, demands to call back now, accusations of betrayal dissolving into pleas for explanation. Through it all, there was no talk of boundaries or respect, only the raw panic of people who had lost access to something they relied on. "What did you do? Why can't we get in? Call me right now, Sophia. This isn't funny. You can't just cut us off like this." Somewhere in the middle of it, a message from someone outside the family slipped through. A simple check-in asking if I was okay. The tone was different enough to make me pause because it wasn't loaded with expectation or accusation, just concern. It struck me then how visible the imbalance had become to anyone willing to look. My family story, the one about misunderstandings and hurt feelings, couldn't fully account for this level of reaction. Cracks were forming in the facade they'd worked so hard to maintain. I didn't respond to the barrage or offer reassurance. Doing so would have softened the reality they needed to face. As the noise eventually tapered off into an uneasy quiet, I understood that something irreversible had happened. They had pushed past the point of plausible deniability, crossed into territory where their actions spoke louder than any narrative they could spin. Whatever came next would be more aggressive, less subtle, because people who believe they are entitled rarely accept limits without escalating. Sitting there in the aftermath with the weight of what I'd done and what they'd done pressing equally on my shoulders, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and resolve. Taking my power back had a cost they would never forgive me for making them pay. The silence after I locked everything down felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately name. Not peaceful or relieved, but taut, like a held breath stretched too long. I realized quickly that it wasn't acceptance settling in on the other side of the line I'd drawn, but recalibration. A pause taken by people who had lost one lever and were reaching for another. Days passed without a single call or message, no accusations, no demands, no frantic questions. That absence carried its own weight because it didn't feel like restraint so much as planning the quiet rearranging of pieces on a board I'd just tipped over. I went about my days with a new awareness, going to work at the law firm where I'd just started as a junior associate, answering emails, keeping my head down, learning the rhythms of my new life. But a part of me stayed alert, tuned to the frequency of what I knew was coming. Because families like mine didn't surrender control. They changed tactics. The first strike arrived disguised as concern, a short message from my mother that mentioned nothing about money or boundaries or the way they'd overstepped, only late at night. A restless heart, a line about not sleeping well, another about my father's blood pressure being higher than usual, higher than it had been in years. And weren't we worried about what this stress was doing to him? There was no accusation, no demand, just a careful placement of blame that turned my stomach because it reframed the situation entirely, cast me not as the person protecting herself, but as the cause of physical harm. I recognized the move immediately for what it was, a deliberate shift that recast me from resource to liability, from help to threat. The subtext was clear: if something happened to your father, it would be your fault. When my father called, his voice was calm in that particular way he used when he believed calmness conferred authority, when he wanted to define the terms of a conversation without appearing emotional. He spoke as if delivering a verdict rather than opening a dialogue. "I'm disappointed in you, Sophia," he said. "I didn't raise you to behave this way." He told me my mother deserved better, that he hadn't expected me to turn out so cold, that children who loved their parents didn't treat them like strangers. Each sentence landed with surgical precision, not loud enough to sound like anger, but sharp enough to cut. He didn't ask what had happened or why I'd drawn my line. He didn't acknowledge the violation that had forced my hand. Those details didn't matter to him. What mattered was restoring a moral hierarchy where I stood below them, obligated to soothe and comply. Lucas followed soon after. His messages were stripped of the neutrality he'd once worn like a badge, no longer trying to mediate or soften the blow, but assigning responsibility outright, telling me our mother cried every day now, that I was the one doing this to her, that the situation was on me to fix. "She's barely eating," he wrote. "Dad can't even talk about you without getting upset. Is this really worth it to you?" In that version of events, there was no graduation, no trip to Paris, no boundary crossed, no unauthorized access to my accounts, only my refusal recast as cruelty. The pattern intensified, not as a single confrontation, but as a steady drip of pressure applied from multiple directions. Messages arriving at odd hours from different people, each one echoing the same theme in slightly altered language. Concern braided with expectation, sympathy laced with insistence. All of it designed not to persuade me with facts, but to wear me down through repetition. An aunt I barely knew reached out to say she was praying for reconciliation. A family friend sent a long message about how short life was and how I'd regret this distance when it was too late. Even my grandmother, my mother's mother, a woman I'd spoken to maybe once a year since childhood, sent a card, handwritten, expressing her hope that I would come to my senses and remember what family means. They didn't gather everyone in a single dramatic confrontation. They didn't need to. The strategy was quieter and more effective, isolating me through constant low-grade contact that made it difficult to rest. Each message reopened the wound just as it started to scab. Each sender is positioned as an individual voice, but clearly drawing from the same script. What struck me as I read through them was what none of them asked. Not one question about what I was feeling or why I'd acted the way I did. No curiosity about the circumstances that led me here. Only a single recurring inquiry, phrased a dozen different ways. When was I going to fix this? When would things go back to normal? When would I resume my place in the arrangement they'd all grown comfortable with? That was the moment the strategy crystallized for me. The instant I stopped interpreting the messages as emotional reactions and started seeing them as enforcement mechanisms, tools meant to herd me back into position without ever addressing the reason I'd stepped out of line in the first place. They didn't want peace or understanding or repair. They wanted compliance. The restoration of a familiar structure that benefited them and cost me. Recognizing that didn't make the pressure disappear. But it changed how it landed, because once you see a tactic for what it is, it loses some of its power to confuse, even if it still hurts. Instead of responding to each message individually, explaining myself over and over to people who weren't listening, I did something I'd never done before, something that felt both terrifying and clarifying. I sent a single measured message to the family group, stripped of emotion and detail, stating plainly that I was taking space and that I would not engage in conversations centered on money or guilt. "I need time and distance," I wrote. "I'm asking you to respect that. I won't be responding to messages about this topic." It wasn't a speech or a defense, just a boundary articulated where everyone could see it. The effect was immediate and telling. Some responses never came at all, the silence from those corners louder than any argument, while others arrived too quickly and with too much intensity, revealing cracks in the unified front they'd tried to present. Frustration bleeding through in sharp bursts, anger surfacing where concern had been the chosen mask moments before. The group dynamic shifted in real time, voices overlapping, tones diverging. For the first time, I could see how much effort it had taken to keep the narrative aligned, how fragile that alignment was once it was forced into the open. I didn't respond to the flurry that followed. The point had already been made. As the noise gradually subsided into something uneven and uncertain, I felt a strange steadiness settle in its wake. The emotional assault hadn't broken me the way they'd intended, hadn't driven me back into apology or explanation. That failure was as significant as any confrontation could have been. Sitting with that realization, I understood that this was the end of one phase and the beginning of another. They'd exhausted the tools they'd relied on for years and would have to find new ones if they wanted to regain control. They had tried guilt. They had tried fear. Neither had worked. As the last unread message sat on my screen, unanswered by choice rather than paralysis, I knew with a certainty that felt almost calm that whatever came next would be different. The old methods were no longer enough. By the time the emotional noise finally thinned out, I realized something inside me had shifted. Not snapped or hardened, but recalibrated. Like a dial turned slowly until it clicked into a new position. For the first time since all of this began, my thoughts stopped circling around how they felt about me and started organizing themselves around what had actually happened. I stopped asking why they would do this, stopped replaying conversations to see where I'd gone wrong. I stopped lying awake at night wondering if I was the problem, if I was being too harsh, if I should just apologize and make things easier for everyone. Instead, I began treating the situation the way I'd been trained to handle problems that mattered, by stripping away the drama and laying out the facts where they could no longer hide behind tone or intention. I opened a document and started a timeline. Not poetic, not defensive, just dates and actions. The day of my graduation, the photos from Paris that arrived without context, the text asking for money, the messages that minimized my achievement, the unauthorized changes to my accounts, the coordinated pressure campaign that followed when access disappeared. Reading it back felt different than remembering it. On paper, there was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, just a pattern that didn't require emotion to be understood. Seeing it laid out that way was clarifying in a way I hadn't expected. It turned something that had felt overwhelming into something concrete, something I could actually respond to without losing myself in it. From there, my attention shifted to the financial threads that had kept me tethered far longer than I'd realized. The recurring transfers, the open-ended commitments, the promises I'd made casually and never revisited because saying yes had always seemed easier than explaining no. I created a spreadsheet, listed every payment I'd made over the past 5 years, the monthly transfers, the emergency requests, the loans that were never repaid, the bills I'd covered because someone was between jobs or going through a rough patch. When I totaled it up, the number made me sit back in my chair. Over $60,000 in 5 years. That was more than some people made in a year. It was a down payment on a house. It was financial security I'd handed over piece by piece, never seeing the whole until now. As I reviewed the entries one by one, it became clear that very few of these obligations were formal or mutual. They existed because I had been consistent, because my reliability had become a substitute for agreements no one ever asked me to sign. There was no contract, no schedule, no expectation of repayment, just an assumption that I would always be there when needed. The truth settled in with uncomfortable simplicity. They hadn't depended on me because they were incapable of managing without my help. They depended on me because I was predictable, because I showed up every time without forcing anyone else to adjust. That realization reframed everything, especially my relationship with Lucas. It dawned on me that his freedom from consequence had been quietly underwritten by my presence in the background. Every failed business venture, every risky investment, every expensive lifestyle choice, none of it had ever truly cost him anything because I had been there to absorb the fallout. My willingness to help meant he never had to face the natural consequences of his decisions. I didn't need to confront him to change that dynamic. I only needed to step out of the position I'd been holding for him, without question. My first real move wasn't dramatic or public. It didn't involve ultimatums or speeches, Just a series of decisions made carefully and quietly, normalizing my finances, severing the invisible lines that connected my stability to their expectations, and doing it in a way that didn't invite negotiation. I set up new accounts, automated my own savings, created a budget that prioritized my future for the first time: retirement contributions, emergency fund, student loan payments. Things I'd delayed for years because there was always someone else who needed the money more urgently. I didn't announce what I was doing or warn anyone it was coming. The point wasn't to provoke a reaction, but to alter the structure beneath the surface, to change the system rather than argue within it. For a while, nothing seemed different, which almost made me doubt myself. But I held steady, trusting the process. Because systems don't always register disruption immediately. Sometimes they continue on momentum until they hit a point where the old inputs are no longer there. When that moment arrived, it was unmistakable. Messages trickling in that sounded confused rather than angry, asking if something was wrong, if there had been a mistake, if I could help them figure out why things weren't working the way they used to. "Hey, the transfer didn't come through this month. Was there a problem with your account?" "Sophia, Mom said you haven't sent the usual amount. Is everything okay?" The shift in tone was subtle but telling. The certainty was gone, replaced by a tentative edge that betrayed a loss of control they couldn't quite name. I read those messages without the familiar rush of obligation, noticing how different it felt to observe rather than react. For the first time, the silence I chose wasn't about protecting myself from hurt, but about protecting the strategy I'd already put in motion. Silence had always frightened me before. It felt like abandonment or escalation. But now it served a purpose, creating space where their assumptions could finally collapse under their own weight. Outside the family, small signs began to surface. Questions asked gently by people who sensed something was off. A hesitancy in conversations where there used to be certainty. Mutual acquaintances who seemed less confident in the story they'd been told. I understood then that reputation isn't lost in one dramatic moment, but eroded slowly when the story stops adding up. I didn't correct anyone or offer explanations. Doing so would have pulled me back into a narrative I no longer needed to participate in. Instead, I focused on maintaining the new boundaries I'd set, reinforcing them through consistency rather than argument. With each day that passed, the balance shifted further. I could feel it even when nothing was said. A subtle but undeniable change in who was waiting on whom. They still thought I was reacting, that my silence was temporary or strategic in the old sense, a pause before capitulation, a phase I'd eventually grow out of. That misunderstanding was the clearest sign that my move had worked, because while they were still looking for the familiar version of me to resurface, I was already operating from a different framework entirely. By the time the weight of that realization settled fully, I knew there was no going back. Not because I was angry or unforgiving, but because the game itself had changed, and they hadn't realized yet that I was no longer playing the role they'd written for me. For a brief stretch of time after everything settled from my first real move, I let myself believe the worst had passed. Not because things felt good, but because the pressure eased in a way that resembled relief. The house suddenly quiet after a storm moves on, leaving behind debris you haven't examined yet. The messages slowed, the calls stopped. The constant sense of being watched or measured faded just enough for me to exhale without bracing myself for the next impact. I didn't feel happy, but I felt stable, and stability can be dangerously convincing when you've lived too long in chaos. I went about my days with that cautious calm, telling myself this was what boundaries were supposed to feel like: a dull ache where the pain used to be sharp. A space where nothing demanded an immediate response. That was when the message arrived. Not from my parents, not from Lucas, but from someone I had never learned to guard myself against. My Aunt Ruth, my mother's younger sister. I'd known Aunt Ruth my entire life. She had always seemed different from the rest of the family, softer somehow, less invested in appearances. She lived 3 states away and rarely got involved in family drama, which made her feel like a safe harbor in a stormy sea. She was the one who had slipped me $20 at my high school graduation when no one else remembered to bring a card. "For something fun," she'd whispered, pressing the bill into my palm. "Not for bills. just for you. She was the one who had called me on my birthday every year, even when my parents forgot. Quick calls, never more than 10 minutes, but consistent. She was the one who had pulled me aside at my grandmother's funeral, squeezed my hand and whispered, "You don't always have to be the strong one, sweetheart. It's okay to let someone else carry the weight sometimes." That was the memory that made me trust her. That single moment of being seen when no one else was looking. I had held on to it for years, a small proof that somewhere in this family there was someone who understood. So when her name appeared on my screen, something in my chest loosened. For a moment, I felt almost grateful, as if this was the universe reminding me I wasn't entirely alone. Her message was gentle, careful, framed like concern rather than accusation. "Hi, sweetie. I've been thinking about you. Your mom mentioned things have been tense, and I just wanted to check in. Are you doing okay? I hope you're taking care of yourself. I'm here if you want to talk." There was no blame in the words themselves, but there was an assumption tucked neatly between the lines, one that positioned me as the disruption, the variable that needed smoothing out so the rest of the system could return to normal. I responded cautiously, not defensive, but not open either, keeping my answers brief and neutral. "Thanks for reaching out. I'm doing okay. I just needed some space." That was when the cracks appeared, small at first, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. She mentioned details she shouldn't have known, references to my finances, to changes I had made quietly, to decisions I hadn't shared with anyone outside the immediate situation. "Your mom said you've been making some changes to the accounts," she wrote, "and that you've been pulling away from everyone. I know things got complicated with the money stuff, but family is family, you know." It landed slowly, the realization that this conversation wasn't happening in a vacuum, that my boundaries had already been discussed, dissected, and repackaged before reaching her. The information she had didn't come from curiosity or coincidence. It came from the same place everything else had come from, filtered and framed in a way that preserved the comfort of the people who had lost control. When I asked how she knew lightly without accusation, she brushed it off. "Oh, you know how families are. People talk. Everyone's just worried about you. We want to make sure you're okay." That was the moment the ground shifted beneath me. She wasn't asking whether I'd been hurt or crossed or disrespected. She wasn't curious about my side of the story. She was asking when I planned to stop making things difficult. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Sophia, honey, I just think you should let this go. Holding on to grudges, it's not healthy. Peace is worth more than being right. They're still your family, and family forgives each other. That's what we do." I sat very still. I thought about that $20, that birthday call, that squeeze of my hand at the funeral. I thought about how I had built an entire narrative around those small gestures, convinced myself that somewhere in this family there was someone who truly saw me, someone who understood what it cost to be the reliable one, someone who would take my side when it mattered. But here was the truth arriving like cold water. She had seen me. She just hadn't chosen me. The safety I'd felt around her had always been conditional, dependent on my willingness to keep the peace. The moment I stopped absorbing tension, the moment I became the source of discomfort rather than the solution to it, her loyalty revealed its limits. She didn't hate me. She didn't doubt my intelligence or my strength. She simply didn't want to deal with the discomfort that came with acknowledging what had happened. So she chose the path that required the least from her, which was asking me to disappear quietly again. I didn't argue with her. I didn't try to convince her otherwise. Something in me recognized that doing so would only repeat the same pattern under a different name, me explaining myself to someone who had already decided which outcome they preferred. "Thank you for reaching out." I wrote back, "I appreciate you thinking of me. I have to go." And when the conversation ended, I sat with the silence it left behind. It was heavier than the ones before because it carried the weight of a door closing I hadn't known was open. I thought about all the times I'd told myself that Aunt Ruth was different, all the hope I'd invested in those small gestures, and I realized that I'd been telling myself a story I needed to believe because the alternative was too lonely to bear. In the days that followed, I made no announcement, staged no confrontation. I simply withdrew, not in anger, but in acknowledgement. I stopped sending her updates, stopped responding to her occasional texts. Let the relationship fade the way you let go of something you finally understand was never what you thought it was. The cut wasn't dramatic, it was surgical, precise enough that it didn't provoke an immediate reaction, just a gradual absence that spoke louder than any explanation could. I realized then how small my circle of actual safety had been all along. How many people had benefited from my role as mediator and absorber. How my willingness to stay quiet had kept others comfortable without ever earning me the protection I assumed it did. The betrayal hurt, not because it surprised me intellectually, but because it dismantled the last illusion I'd been holding on to, the belief that somewhere within the family network there was someone who would choose truth over ease when it mattered. As that belief fell away, something else took its place. A sharper, more accurate map of the system I'd been navigating, one that showed not just my family, but the surrounding structure that depended on my compliance to function smoothly. Seeing it clearly didn't make me angry. It made me resolute. Because clarity has a way of stripping choices down to their essence. I understood that waiting for understanding from people who needed me small was a losing game. And that solitude chosen intentionally was far less dangerous than belonging that required erasure. By the time the full weight of that realization settled, the path forward felt narrow but solid. Whatever came next would have to be built without the false reassurance of conditional loyalty. If loyalty required me to disappear, it was never loyalty to begin with. By the time the silence settled after the last fracture, I wasn't waiting for anything to fill it. That was how I knew I had reached the lowest point without falling apart, because there was no longer a part of me scanning for rescue. No instinct left that believed understanding would arrive if I just explained myself one more time. I stopped offering context, stopped translating my choices into language designed to soothe other people's discomfort. In that quiet withdrawal, there was no drama, no collapse, only a clear and empty space where expectation used to live. It wasn't sadness in the way people imagine it, sharp and consuming, but a flat, lucid stillness. The kind that comes when you finally accept that pleading for fairness from an unfair system is a waste of energy. I went to work, completed my tasks, spoke when necessary, and kept my life contained. Not because I was hiding, but because there was nothing left I needed to prove. There was a woman on my team named Margaret. Late 50s gray hair, she never bothered to dye reading glasses, perpetually pushed up on her forehead like she'd forgotten they were there. She'd been at the firm for 23 years and had a reputation for being direct to the point of discomfort. Partners respected her. Associates feared her. Junior staff either loved her or avoided her entirely. I had worked alongside her for months without much conversation beyond project updates and deadline confirmations. She wasn't warm. She wasn't cold either. She was simply present, efficient, observant, and utterly uninterested in small talk. She didn't ask about weekends or comment on the weather. She didn't remember birthdays or organize office celebrations. But she noticed things. She noticed when someone's work quality changed, when someone started coming in earlier or leaving later, when someone stopped laughing at meetings. One afternoon, we were both in the break room at the same time. I was staring at my coffee, not really seeing it, lost in the familiar loop of thoughts I couldn't seem to escape. When she sat down across from me, I startled slightly. "You've been quieter than usual," she said. Not a question, just an observation. I looked up. "Just some family stuff." She nodded slowly. Didn't push. Didn't offer advice. Didn't tilt her head with that sympathetic look people give when they want you to know they care without actually having to do anything about it. She just said, "Family stuff has a way of following you into the office, doesn't it?" It wasn't sympathy, it was recognition, the kind that comes from someone who has carried their own weight and doesn't pretend otherwise. "It does," I said. And then, because she hadn't asked, but somehow created space for me to answer anyway, I added, "I'm handling it." She looked at me for a long moment. "I'm sure you are," she said. And then she picked up her coffee and went back to work. Over the next few weeks, we fell into a pattern. Brief conversations in the break room, comments exchanged over shared projects, questions about work that occasionally drifted into other territory. Nothing dramatic, nothing that looked like friendship from the outside, but something was building a quiet understanding between two people who didn't need to perform for each other. Then came the day she found me in the stairwell. I hadn't meant to go there. I just needed a moment away from my desk, away from my phone, away from the low hum of tension that followed me everywhere. The office was having one of those loud celebratory days. Someone had landed a big client. There was cake in the conference room. People were laughing and congratulating each other. I couldn't make my face do what it was supposed to do. So I slipped out and found a quiet corner on the stairs between floors where no one ever went. I was sitting on the concrete steps, staring at nothing, when the door opened and Margaret appeared. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't apologize for intruding or offer to leave. She just walked over, sat down one step below me with her back against the railing and said, "Tell me." So I did. I told her about the graduation, about Paris, about the text asking for money, about the unauthorized access to my accounts, about my aunt's betrayal, about the coordinated campaign to make me the villain in a story where I'd only tried to protect myself. I told it without cushioning it for her comfort, without editing out the parts that might make me seem difficult or ungrateful, without apologizing for the length or the mess of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. I could hear the distant sound of celebration from 2 floors up, muffled by concrete and closed doors. Then she said, "So they're not upset about losing you. They're upset about losing control over you." The words landed like a key turning in a lock. "That's different," she continued. "People mix those up all the time. They think if someone's angry, it must mean they care. But anger about losing access isn't the same as grief about losing a person. One is about them. The other would actually be about you." I felt something shift in my chest. Not relief, exactly. Recognition. She looked at me directly. "You're not wrong to protect yourself, and anyone who tells you that boundaries make you cold has never had to build one to survive." There was no suggestion that I reconsider. No gentle pressure to see things from my family's perspective. No request that I soften my stance for the sake of appearances. In that absence of expectation, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Solid ground. The conversation lasted maybe 20 minutes. Then we both went back to work. She didn't bring it up again unless I did. Didn't treat me differently in front of others. Didn't announce herself as my ally or make our exchange into something larger than it was. But something had changed. In the weeks that followed, Margaret included me in conversations I would have been left out of before, mentioned my name to people she respected, recommended me for a project that raised my visibility in the firm, not as a favor, not with any fanfare, just a quiet word in the right ear at the right time. She introduced me to a partner she'd worked with for years, framing me as someone worth knowing. None of it was dramatic. None of it was framed as a rescue. She simply made space for me in rooms where I hadn't existed before. That was when I understood what support actually looked like. It wasn't constant reassurance or emotional processing. It wasn't someone telling me I was right and they were wrong. It wasn't validation or vindication or any of the things I'd been unconsciously hoping for. It was someone treating my judgment as valid without requiring me to justify it every time. It was being seen as a whole person rather than a problem to be managed. In those new spaces, no one asked how things were at home or whether I planned to make peace. They asked about my ideas, my goals, my availability. They treated me like an adult capable of making my own decisions, which I realized was something my family had never done. The contrast was subtle but profound. Somewhere in the background, my family sensed the shift, not through any announcement, but through absence. The lack of reaction they were used to provoking, the subtle feeling that I was no longer positioned where they could reach me easily. There was a change in tone in their occasional messages, a slight hesitation where confidence once lived, as if they were realizing the familiar levers no longer produced the same results. I didn't celebrate that realization or track it closely. My attention had moved elsewhere toward spaces where my presence was welcomed without condition, where my boundaries weren't treated as obstacles, but as facts to be respected. In those spaces, I found that I didn't need to shrink or perform resilience. I could simply be. That simplicity felt more powerful than any argument I'd ever made. Looking back, it became clear that the difference between spectators and allies wasn't volume or intensity, but cost the willingness to endure discomfort for the sake of truth, rather than demanding that truth be sacrificed for peace. My family had wanted quiet, needed me to absorb tension so the system could function smoothly. They had offered love that came with conditions and support that came with strings. Margaret had simply treated me like an adult, capable of making my own decisions. That was enough. I didn't need everyone to believe me. I just needed one person who didn't need me to disappear. By the time everything finally shifted, there was no anger left to burn through me, no dramatic sense of confrontation or victory. Just a calm that felt almost unsettling in its steadiness, the kind that comes when you've already made peace with your decisions and no longer need the world to validate them. My days moved forward with a quiet precision. Work completed, emails answered. Plans made that didn't factor in anyone else's emergencies or expectations. I woke up, went about my routines, and noticed that my family no longer occupied the background noise of my thoughts. Not because I was suppressing them, but because they no longer held operational relevance in my life. The space they'd once filled had been repurposed, structured around my own future rather than their ongoing needs. I started thinking about what I wanted, really wanted for the first time in years. Not what would help someone else, not what would keep the peace. What did I want my life to look like? Where did I want to live? What kind of relationships did I want to build? The questions felt foreign at first, like speaking a language I'd learned as a child and forgotten. Somewhere in that stillness, the truth settled fully into place. The loudest revenge wasn't anger. It was indifference, reinforced by structure. Once I understood that, the rest unfolded without ceremony. I didn't announce any changes or issue ultimatums, didn't send a message explaining my reasoning or outlining new boundaries. I simply stopped paying. The automatic transfers ended. The recurring expenses quietly fell off my ledger. The temporary support that had somehow become permanent was removed without comment. There was no farewell note, no moral framing, just the clean absence of funds where there had once been predictability. That absence did what no argument ever could. The reaction was immediate, not in its emotional intensity, but in its frequency. Messages stacking one after another, questions disguised as confusion rather than accusation, asking if there'd been a mistake, if something hadn't gone through, if I could check on my end because things didn't seem to be lining up. Sophia, the payment didn't come through this month. Is there a problem with your bank? We're a little short this month and we're counting on that transfer. The tone had shifted completely, stripped of authority and entitlement, replaced by a thin layer of concern that barely concealed panic. For the first time, I could see the dependency clearly, not as a character flaw, but as a system failure that had been masked by my compliance for years. I didn't respond to any of it, didn't clarify or reassure, didn't confirm or deny, because my silence wasn't avoidable anymore. It was an answer in itself. That lack of response dismantled their remaining leverage faster than any confrontation could have. They weren't panicking because I'd said no. They were panicking because I'd said nothing at all, leaving them without a script, without a role to assign me, without a way to frame the situation that restored their sense of control. In the absence of my participation, their internal coordination began to fracture. I heard later through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances that there had been arguments, blame shifting from one family member to another. Explanations changed depending on who was asking. The familiar confidence dissolving into uncertainty as they tried to manage the fallout without the safety net they'd come to rely on. Outside that closed loop, subtle changes became visible. Not because anyone accused them or took my side, but because there was suddenly less to show. Fewer markers of stability to display, fewer signs of the lifestyle they'd maintained through my quiet contributions. Lucas's latest business venture had to be scaled back. My parents talked about downsizing, about selling the house, about simplifying. The vacation to Europe they'd been planning was quietly canceled. None of it was dramatic or widely discussed, just a noticeable thinning of appearances, a scaling back that raised unspoken questions in the minds of those who'd grown accustomed to a certain image. I remained untouched by that scrutiny, insulated by the new spaces I'd stepped into, environments where my value wasn't measured by what I provided to others, but by what I brought to the table myself, where my name carried weight independent of my family's narrative. In those spaces, I was addressed directly, trusted with responsibility, met with respect that didn't come with strings attached. The contrast sharpened my awareness of how much power I'd relinquished in the past simply by being available. The defining moment arrived quietly. It was at a work event, a networking function where several people from my professional circle had gathered. I wasn't there, but Margaret was. And so, as it turned out, were some acquaintances who knew my family. During a small social exchange, someone mentioned my name, asked Margaret if she knew me, asked if I was related to those Whitmores. Without my participation to smooth the edges or redirect blame, my family's explanation of my absence faltered, riddled with inconsistencies and vague justifications that satisfied no one. "She's been busy with work. She's going through something. You know how young people are these days." No one challenged them outright. No accusations were made. But the discomfort was unmistakable, the kind that settles in when a story no longer holds together under its own weight. Margaret told me about it later, in her characteristically matter-of-fact way. "They seemed embarrassed," she said. "Couldn't explain why you weren't there without making yourself look bad." The embarrassment belonged entirely to them, generated by their own words, rather than anything I'd said or done. I heard about it secondhand, and the information didn't spark satisfaction so much as confirmation evidence that the system had finally been exposed by its own dependence on me. Looking back over the weeks that followed, I noticed what had truly changed wasn't their behavior so much as my position within it. I was no longer the first call, no longer the assumed solution, no longer the invisible resource propping everything up from behind the scenes. The quiet was clean, unburdened by guilt or second-guessing. In that clarity, I understood that I hadn't taken revenge at all. I'd taken my life back, reclaimed the agency I'd outsourced for years. They'd noticed only after the infrastructure they relied on had already been dismantled. Standing there with my future unfolding on my own terms, I recognized the shift for what it was, a complete reversal of dependency. For the first time, they needed me more than I needed them. In that realization, I finally understood what power really meant. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. My cousin's wedding, 3 months away. A formal card with gold lettering and my name written in careful script, as if nothing had happened, as if the past several months had been a pause rather than a rupture. I held the card for a long time, turning it over in my hands. The return address was my aunt's, not Aunt Ruth, but another aunt, one I barely knew. The invitation itself was beautiful, cream-colored cardstock, embossed letters, a delicate ribbon tied around the envelope. A traditional wedding for traditional people who believed in traditional things like family unity and showing up and pretending everything was fine. This was the test I'd known was coming. Not a phone call I could ignore. Not a text I could leave on read. A public event, a family gathering. A stage where my absence would be noticed and my presence would be interpreted. The messages started within days of the invitation arriving. "We really hope you'll come. It would mean so much to your cousin. Family is family, Sophia." The words were carefully chosen, stripped of accusation, framed as invitations rather than demands. But they carried a familiar shape, one I recognized immediately: access without accountability. There was no apology tucked between the lines, no acknowledgement of harm, only a request to reset the board to a version where everyone could keep their positions. Then came the calls from extended family. People I hadn't spoken to in months, suddenly reaching out with the same gentle pressure. "You only get one mother. You don't want to regret this someday. Whatever happened, surely it can be worked out. Life is short, Sophia. Family is forever." The comments weren't informed by facts or malice. They were shaped by discomfort, by the collective unease that settles when someone refuses to perform the role everyone's grown accustomed to. I understood then that the wedding wasn't really about my cousin. It was a referendum, a chance for my family to demonstrate that order had been restored, that the prodigal daughter had returned, that whatever unpleasantness had occurred was now behind us. My presence would be their proof. My absence would be my statement. I thought about what it would cost me to go. The small talk I'd have to navigate with relatives who had chosen not to ask my side of the story. The concerned glances, the whispered conversations that would stop when I approached. The questions are phrased as caring, but designed to extract information. The exhausting performance of normalcy, while everyone waited to see if I'd cracked. I thought about sitting at a table with my mother, pretending we hadn't crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. I thought about watching Lucas charm the room with his easy smile, knowing I had funded his freedom. I thought about my father making a toast about family values and the importance of sticking together, his eyes sliding past me as if I weren't there. I thought about what it would cost me not to go, the story they'd tell about my absence, the way it would confirm every narrative they'd built, the permanent position it would assign me in the family mythology, the cold one, the ungrateful one, the one who couldn't let go of a grudge. And then I asked myself the question that mattered most. What do I actually want? Not what would make them comfortable, not what would prove my point, not what would satisfy some abstract notion of justice or fairness. What did I want? The answer came quietly without drama. I wanted peace, not their version of peace, the kind that required my silence and compliance. Real peace, the kind that came from no longer arranging my life around their expectations. I wrote back to the cousin directly, a brief note congratulating her on her engagement, wishing her happiness, explaining that I wouldn't be able to attend, but that I hoped her day was everything she wanted it to be. I sent a separate message to my mother, not angry, not defensive, just clear. I won't be at the wedding. I wish the family well, but I'm not ready to be in that space. I hope you can understand. The response came within minutes. Not explosive, but telling. It sidestepped my words entirely, circled instead around how difficult this was for them, how hurt they felt, how unnecessary this distance seemed if I truly cared about family. "You're really going to miss your cousin's wedding," my mother wrote. "After everything, this will follow you forever, Sophia. People won't forget." They didn't reject my boundary outright. They ignored it, which was its own answer. At that moment, the choice crystallized, not as mercy versus cruelty, but as mercy versus power. I understood that choosing power didn't mean punishing anyone. It meant refusing to bleed so others could feel whole. I didn't cut them off completely or close the door with finality. I simply left it where it was on my terms, no longer the center of my decisions or the measure of my worth. The wedding came and went. I spent that Saturday hiking alone on a trail I'd been wanting to explore for months. The kind of hike that required attention, steep in places, rocky in others, with views that made you stop and catch your breath. I turned my phone off and put it in my backpack. The autumn air was sharp and clean in my lungs. The leaves were changing colors, reds and golds scattered across the forest floor. I didn't think about what was happening in that reception hall. I thought about the trail ahead of me. The next step, the next breath, the way my body felt moving through space, strong and capable, and entirely my own. At the summit, I sat on a rock and ate a sandwich I'd packed. The view stretched for miles. I could see other hikers on distant trails, tiny figures making their way up their own mountains. I thought about how strange it was that a year ago I would have been at that wedding, playing my role, smiling on cue, going home exhausted and hollow. When I turned my phone back on that evening, there were no messages, no calls, just silence. It was the first silence that felt like mine. There was no triumph in it, no dramatic sense of victory, just a steady alignment with myself that felt more honest than anything I'd known before. I didn't need to win against them or prove anything to the world. I only needed to stop losing myself in the process of being acceptable. I chose power not to deny them mercy, but to finally extend it to myself. Peace didn't arrive with fireworks or a dramatic sense of closure. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed at first, because no one was pulling me back anymore. My days stopped revolving around anticipating emergencies that weren't mine to solve. My phone stayed where I left it without the reflex to check whether someone needed something. The constant mental calculus, am I being unfair? Am I overreacting? Am I about to disappoint someone, simply dissolved. Work filled the space with its own rhythm. I was building a reputation at the firm now known for thorough preparation and clear thinking. I got my first solo client, then a second. Partners started knowing my name. Plans unfolded without contingency clauses for other people's crises. The absence of that old tension felt unfamiliar in a way that took time to trust. I realized I wasn't proving anything anymore. Not my loyalty, not my usefulness, not my capacity to endure. The relief of that realization settled slowly, like a body learning a new posture after years of strain. I started doing things just because I wanted to. I took a weekend trip to the coast for no reason other than that I'd never seen that particular stretch of beach. I signed up for a pottery class because I'd always been curious about working with clay. Bought flowers for my apartment, something I'd never done before because it had always seemed frivolous. Now it seemed like exactly the kind of small pleasure I'd been denying myself for far too long. When I looked back at the version of myself who had carried everything without complaint, I didn't feel anger or contempt, only distance. A clear-eyed understanding of how thoroughly she'd been conditioned to disappear. She showed up early, paid without being asked, stayed quiet when something hurt. I learned to equate love with reliability. She had believed that if she just gave enough, eventually she would receive something in return. She had waited her whole life for a moment of recognition that never came. She wasn't weak, she was trained. Once I saw that distinction, the shame I'd carried for so long lost its grip. The consequences for my family continued to unfold somewhere beyond my immediate awareness. Not because I was avoiding the truth, but because their outcomes were no longer mine to manage. I heard fragments through other people, vague references to adjustments and changes to difficult times and family stuff. Lucas's business finally failed for good. My parents sold the house I'd grown up in and moved to a smaller place. There was talk of my father retiring early, of belt-tightening, of getting back to basics. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. Disengaging meant relinquishing the role of witness as well as caretaker. Their image shifted without my participation. Whatever came of that belonged to them, not as punishment, but as the natural result of a system recalibrating after losing its central support. In the meantime, my world expanded in quieter, more deliberate ways. Through relationships that didn't demand performance or sacrifice as the price of belonging, through friendships with people like Margaret, people who treated me like an adult from day one, through connections that functioned without roles attached, where support moved in both directions and help didn't come with an invoice written in silence. I learned how to accept assistance without translating it into debt, how to show up without vanishing, how to recognize that love which cost your voice isn't love at all. It's a transaction you were never told you could refuse. The mirror moment came unexpectedly. A message passed along through someone else, softer than before, stripped of urgency and demand, asking how I was, expressing a vague hope that things might be better someday. It came through a cousin I'd always liked, one who had stayed neutral during everything, who hadn't taken sides or spread stories. She said my mother had asked her to reach out, said there had been talk of wanting to rebuild and start fresh, said they missed me. I read it without the familiar spike of emotion, without the internal debate about whether I owed a response, without the automatic guilt that used to flood my chest at any suggestion that I was causing pain. In that neutrality, the difference was unmistakable. The message hadn't changed. I had. I could see it for what it was, an attempt at connection that didn't yet understand the boundaries required to make it real. They were offering the same terms they'd always offered my compliance in exchange for their approval, and calling it reconciliation. Instead of feeling compelled to answer, I allowed it to exist without action, trusting my judgment for the first time. "Thanks for letting me know." I wrote back to my cousin, "I'm doing well. I'm not ready for contact right now, but I appreciate you reaching out." Naming the truth no longer felt like an act of defiance. It was simply accurate to say that they hadn't forgotten me, they'd just remembered me when it was convenient. That recognition no longer made me smaller or uncertain. I didn't need them to choose me retroactively or validate my absence to justify my decision. My life had already adjusted around the absence of their expectations. It was fuller than it had ever been. Not louder or busier, but more honestly mine. The version of myself standing here didn't measure success by degrees earned or titles achieved, but by the freedom to walk away without explanation, to live without being summoned, to remain intact in spaces that once demanded erosion. When I say I'm not who I was, it isn't a declaration of superiority or bitterness. It's a simple acknowledgement of growth that didn't require anyone else's participation. I didn't burn bridges or dramatize my exit. I stopped standing on them while they collapsed. The quiet that followed felt like ground at last. Some evenings now I sit on my balcony with a glass of wine and watch the sun go down. I think about the woman I used to be, the one who was always running toward the next crisis, the next need, the next chance to prove her worth. I think about how tired she was, how invisible she felt even in rooms full of family. I don't miss her exactly, but I'm grateful to her. She survived long enough for me to arrive. The phone doesn't ring with emergencies anymore. The bank account doesn't drain toward other people's problems. The calendar isn't filled with obligations I never chose. And when I think about the future, really think about it with hope instead of dread, I don't see myself alone. I see myself surrounded by people who chose to be there, people who don't need me to be small to feel big. That's what peace looks like, I think. Not the absence of conflict, the presence of choice. If this story landed somewhere close to home, tell me, when did you realize it was time to stop paying for silence? And if you've ever been the invisible one in your own family, know this. You're not alone here.